was the future of the young people, the people that you're talking to, endangered quite significantly to save a number of lives that was similar to a severe flu season? The people who are denying that COVID is like flu are doing it for political reasons. Yes, I'm a guilty baby boomer. I feel guilty about what my generation has done. And I'm surprised the young people aren't more angry. I think this is still coming. I think what we're seeing in America, the political unrest, is poor fighting rich.
My guest today, Professor Michael Levitt, Professor of Structural Biology at Stanford University. In 2013, he received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Since the beginning of Corona, Levitt has been evaluating the available data to make predictions about the further course of the pandemic. His forecasts on China at the beginning were remarkably precise. Since then, Levitt has attracted a lot of media attention with his controversial statements. He does not see any major threat to humanity from the virus.
I realize that there's a great deal of panic and fear.
What worries him more and how Corona will continue, more about that now. So, welcome to the show. Hi, Michael. Good afternoon to you.
Hello, Henrik. Nice to be here.
Yes. Thank you very much for taking your time. I really appreciate it. It's really an honor to have you here in this show. And Michael, let's discuss on your latest observations on the pandemic. I remember I read an article about you in, I think it was mid-March, and there was an interview. And at that time, everyone was basically panicking, especially in Europe. We saw the numbers rising, and people just got afraid. And I remember the words from the interview with you, and in that interview you said, keep calm, the numbers will go down soon. And I was thinking like, wow, that's like kind of flamboyant opinion at that time. He must be very sure of what he's talking about. And you caused a lot of controversy with this. Some people, I read comments and they said, cobbler, stick to your last. What qualifies you as, I mean, you're a scientist, but you're not an epidemiologist. What qualifies you to take a stand on this subject?
So I felt that part of epidemiology is looking at numbers. Essentially, in most cases, number of total cases, a number of total deaths, as a function of time. It's a bit like a time series. And there are lots of properties of data that are very general. I do a lot of data analysis in my own work, and I actually have a real love for data analysis. I've analyzed all sorts of things that we'll never even think about analyzing, so I kind of like data. But that really wasn't the reason why I got involved in Corona. In Corona, I actually had a personal connection with people in China who were under a situation of great stress. And when I saw how upset they were, which is not surprising, we're now talking about the last week of January, I wanted to basically look at the numbers to maybe try to see if there's any good hope for them. And quite quickly, I actually found two very hopeful signs. So I actually wrote a 2-pager, sent it to the Chinese WeChat to my friends. It got leaked. It became sort of viral in its own. Continued analyzing China for the whole rest of February. So by the middle of March, I'd already been doing it for 6 weeks. It wasn't an opinion. It was based on a lot of data. I actually don't like to have an opinion. I like to feel that I'm the data whisperer, in the sense that I listen to the data and I try to make sense of it. And, generally data doesn't lie, because data has to be consistent. So if you have, if I say the number of deaths total deaths is 1, 2, and then 1 again, you say, that's very strange. We have less deaths today than yesterday. How can that be? And this is the total number. It's not the data number per day. So there's certain rules that make you confident about the data.
Hopeful is, I think, the right term. Your numbers were much more hopeful than the numbers that were presented by other experts and epidemiologists. And I mean, your numbers turned out to be pretty much accurate, at least for China. You predicted should be around 80,000 cases and I think 3,500 deaths. And it turned out it was roughly about 82, 83,000, something like that, and 4,500. So it's pretty much accurate. Can you might tell us a little bit about them? I mean, there are a lot of models circulating and a lot of calculation has been made. But what made your calculation so more hopeful? What were the ingredients that you threw into this?
So the basic ingredient was not to have a model, but just to look at the data, as I've already said. And there were two things about the data very early on that were very encouraging. One was that in China, when I started studying this, I think there was 7 days worth of data. So that would be 4 numbers a day, because there were 2 regions and 7 days of data. And even there, you could see some signs that the ratio of to data yesterday was getting smaller and smaller. So the exponential increase was decreasing. And in fact, subsequently, we saw that it's never really exponential. The exponential is decreasing every single day in a very steady way. And this allowed us to see that it was slowing down, but also to see that it was likely to end. And my first guess was it would end in late February. It wasn't quite like that. Getting the final numbers right is something that I think we can now do, but I certainly couldn't really do it then. I got it right by basically following it every single day and updating my prediction. It's particularly hard very early on. I think in the first 2 weeks, any estimate of the numbers is probably going to be very badly off. But once you're in to weeks 3 and 4, it becomes much easier. But the important thing was to see, there were 2 things. One was to see that it was growing relatively slowly. The other was, in a totally different piece of work, I studied the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which other people had done, but I was one of the in most of these things, what I did was not terribly innovative, but it was the first, because I was actually on the ground looking at this from the end of January. And what I saw for the Diamond Princess was that even when the infection went crazy and it was up to 20%, the number of deaths was, at that time, I said 2 or 3 times worse than flu, which is bad. I mean, flu is not an easy disease, but it wasn't 10 times flu. It was, maybe 1,000, 1 person per 1,000 or something like that. Yeah. It turns out that those numbers were actually too high, because subsequently we've seen that in Europe, at least, it's not nearly as bad as that.
I also remember this cruise ship vessel. And I wondered at that time, when the numbers were published, that it wasn't taken that much into consideration of officials. I mean, of course, also to me as a non-scientist, it sounds like some sort of counterintuitive in the first place, that you should conclude or should compare what's happening in a country to what's happening on the cruise ship. But I can say I worked on a cruise ship myself for a couple of years. And as you said, this is the perfect environment for a virus to spread easily and to go crazy and cause crazy effects. And I think that from a scientific perspective was also a good, it was one of the few close populations, so to say, where you had very rare influences or no influences at all from the outside. So you have this exaggeration of reality, so to say, because you have this shared facilities, you have shared air conditioning, and so forth and so forth. You think that there have been methodological mistakes been made by experts, that they haven't taken such information too much into account?
Well, I don't know. I think one of the problems is, I think oftentimes people make decisions about the data. For example, you could say that on the cruise ship, population of 3,700, a total of 7 deaths, that's just like random. Except the infection rate was very high. They were tested all the time. Infection rate was 20%. And also I worked out the population density of a cruise ship, and it's 250,000 people per square kilometer. So it's 40 times more dense than Hong Kong, because the area of a cruise ship is small.
It's 40 times more than Hong Kong.
40 times more than Hong Kong. I actually put that in a newspaper article that I published in the middle of March. Yeah. But what is also important, when I consider China, I noticed that you could divide China into 2 regions. One was the province of Hubei, where Wuhan was, and where there was a relatively high death rate. And the other was outside Hubei, and that had a much lower death rate. So whenever you see a situation like this, rather than saying the average is 3%, you should say it's 5% and 0.5%. That way you got to, and then you have to understand each of them separately. I think in this case, looking at a location, not aggregating the data is a good idea. So I say that is a method, but apparently, I have friends who are in McKinsey in consulting for businesses, and they always say, you break the data up. You look at, shoe business and clothes business separately. You don't say, you often get confusion. I think that other people did study the Diamond Princess. I didn't have a model, so I had no model that would tell me what to expect. I just always looked at the data. It turned out that after the Diamond Princess, I realized that in the city of Wuhan, it had also reached a quite high level of infection, given its death rate. The trouble with Corona, we realized immediately, was that it's very hard to define what a case is. In Wuhan, halfway through, they suddenly said, we have another 10,000 clinical cases that are not defined by looking for the viral RNA. And then the same thing happened in New York City. Later in Wuhan, they released extra deaths that they said were reclassified. So I think the classification is very difficult. And we tried to find methods that were classification independent and therefore focus on what we know very well for any location is the population and the number of deaths. And in Wuhan, the number of deaths per million ended up being about 500. And that's good to know that.
So your suggestion is to relate the number of deaths against the number of the whole population, and not like we see it in the media that you rank the number of deaths compared to the number of infected people.
We don't know how many people are infected. Yes. I mean, we know how many. We have measure of cases, but for example, a case in Germany, for every case in Germany, or every 10 cases in Germany, there was one case in it. I mean, in Germany, it was much better measurement. And I think I saw somewhere else that it was even more. I forget where it was, but there was one place, I think maybe in Singapore. In Singapore, they had like 1,000 cases for each death. Whereas in Italy, there were 10 cases for each death. And the deaths are the same because it's the same virus. So we know deaths, we know population, and also it actually gave a sensible number. It didn't need to, but we've seen that when countries or cities or whatever are very badly infected, they never seem to go above a certain limit in the number of deaths per population. So that's also good to know.
That goes along with the statement you did at the beginning, where you said that the virus was never going to grow exponentially. How did you come about this? Just by looking at the numbers?
Yes, you can. It turns out that you can. A number that I looked at very early on, which is an obvious number, is, for example, the number of deaths today, the total number of deaths today, divided by the number yesterday. That number has to be greater than 1. And that number is just a ratio. It turns out if you take that number and you take the log of the number and you plot it on a log scale, you get a straight line decreasing. I have done this in Twitter. I became quite keen on Twitter. So the numbers just look like they're decreasing. It's a line like this. I mean, it's nothing. It's not rocket science. But if you see numbers, that on the first day, basically, if you went to a bank and they were offering you interest, and the first day they give you 100%, and the next day they said, "Oops, sorry, 50% today," and the next day 25%, and then 12.5%. Very soon, you would be getting no interest at all, or a terribly tiny amount. And the virus is essentially doing that, not as fast as I said. Typically, we found that the infection from today to tomorrow decreases by about 15% a day. This was seen in Hubei, it was seen in China, non-Hubei, it was seen in South Korea, it's been seen in New Zealand. You can see it in many places.
And you just said that the number of per million in Hubei or Wuhan was about, what was it, 500, you said, right?
It's a little bit difficult because one thing we don't know is what was the population of Wuhan, because the nominal population of Wuhan is 11 million. The trouble is that there were about 5,000 deaths. The thing is that 4,500, but in the newspapers, they said that about 5 million people had left Wuhan before the the holidays. They were the ones who brought the cases to the rest of China.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know
it was
the
in December.
No, actually in January. The Chinese New Year was the 24th of January. And before that, people go back to their homes. And they locked down in Wuhan on the 23rd of January, after actually giving a warning. I mean, this is very un-Chinese. They actually said they were going to lock down, and people left.
Mm-hmm.
And then they locked down. So we don't really know, but it still fits. You know, if you have 10 million people, 5,000 deaths, that's 450 per million.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that for all of Europe, there's actually very good data on all of Europe. The number of excess deaths in all of Europe is 480 per million.
Mm-hmm.
So very similar numbers.
So it's matching. On the
That's
other
matching.
side,
York is higher.
Okay, but on the other side, there might be people arguing that is due to the lockdown that has been.
Well, but Sweden is going to be the same number as well. Switzerland practiced a very weak form of lockdown. If you compare Austria and Switzerland, they're similar countries. Austria has a few hundred deaths. Switzerland had 2,000 deaths. So I think this is an argument you can always make, except for Sweden. And then people like to say that Sweden locked down. I think that, to give you an example, I didn't publish that much, and I had reports that I put out on the internet. But one thing I did publish was on the 22nd of March, I wrote an article in the Medium.
Yeah.
And there I basically said that the burden of death to reach some kind of saturation, like the Diamond Princess, I use that number, would be about 1 month of normal death. Now, so far for Europe, 480 per million is 3 weeks of normal death. So basically, and at that time, the estimate we were getting from other epidemiologists was 1 year of natural death. In fact,
1.5. I remember this.
And basically, I saw the article. It was a very nice article by Bigelhagel at Cambridge University, and he said 1 year. And I actually thought that was a very clever way of giving the death. You said it was 500,000. It sounded terrible. If you said it was like 1 year, well, 1 year. But it turns out that it's much, much closer. And actually, my article said it was a great thing he'd said, but I said very flat out, it's not 1 year, it's 1 month. And that's something which has held up. And that really came initially from the Diamond Princess, but it was subsequently confirmed by Wuhan. And in the, by the time I wrote that article on the 22nd of March, I already said it was Wuhan. Now, what was interesting was that in the middle of April, the Wuhan numbers jumped by 50%. And that sort of matched because my numbers were too low. So it all fits together.
You were just talking about Sweden. Just before we started this interview, I read an interview that was released today with Anders Tegnell, the architect of the Swedish approach.
Hero.
Yes, but he admitted in this interview that there were too many deaths in Sweden, and that if he would decide next time, he would do it differently. He would install more lockdown measures. That's just up to date.
But the thing is that the deaths in Sweden look like the same as the rest of Europe. I mean, Sweden has a population of 10 million. It has 5,000 deaths. Right now, I think it's 4,700 or 800.
Yeah.
Now they're going to increase, but I think where you could save, if you wanted to save deaths, and this is something which every country, you could have particularly protected the people who were over 85 years old. It's not easy to do. It's not cheap to do. But if you could make the following argument, let's say that governments felt that they had to lock down because of the death toll. And that cost a lot of money. I mean, there's no doubt that the price of lockdown everywhere is going to be very, very high, economically, politically, socially, etc. So if you were to estimate that the cost of lockdown will be, 10% of your GDP or something like that, then you might think what else you could do. And I think if you were prepared to spend, let's say, 2 million euros to save a life of somebody over 85, you could do it. Most governments are not prepared to do that. I mean, unfortunately, governments do have a scale for valuing healthcare, for valuing lives. And it's typically maybe 50,000 Swiss francs per added year or 50,000 euro. I mean, it's not 10 million. I don't know. It would not be so easy because typically what's happening is that coronavirus and COVID are killing people who are in some ways weak. And these are the same people that flu kills. I found that the age range death of COVID in Europe is exactly the same as the age range death of flu. There was no flu for the last 2 years. So now you could argue that there were many people who would have not survived a severe flu who were here. I'm not sure that it's right. I think with extraordinary expenditure, for example, you would have to have all the carers in these homes have full protective equipment, not leave, not move from one home to the next. And I think it would be relatively easy. The thing is, you would save people who would then maybe not survive for more than a few months. In a nursing home environment, the number of people who die every year is a third. So, you know, it's something. The other thing is also the numbers we're seeing, the 5,000 deaths for Sweden is reported deaths. It's not excess deaths. And I think we see in other places that the excess deaths are lower. So we'll have to see. I don't know. I think, you know, my guess is that he's saying this to avoid pressure on him because the Swedes are very angry with him. And I think for all the wrong reasons. I think he did exactly the right thing.
And I think you also have to take into account where these deaths happened, right? I think the vast majority of death in Sweden happened in care homes. I think it was
but that's
80% or something.
70%, yeah, and which is very high. But someone was telling me that in Sweden, you know, it depends when you go to a care home. Some care homes are like places of last resort. Other care homes, I think in Sweden, they encourage you, the social services give you a lot of help. No, not to go earlier, to go later. And if you go earlier, then you are healthier. So for example, in Israel, a lot of people, they have very luxurious care homes that you know, like a luxurious community, like living in Palm Springs or something like that. But I think in Sweden, where people are very independent, they make it very easy for a single person to stay at home if they can manage to some extent. So that's another reason why. But, you know, in New York, there were 50% in care homes. I think in Israel, maybe 30 or 40%. It's higher, but I think, you know, it's a difficult decision to make. How much money you want to spend. You know, the system in any country, you always have to decide where you spend your money. And if you want to spend the money, and it would be very easy if a country decided that what it really wants to do is have the longest longevity of any country in the world. And it didn't really care too much about any other things. You might be able to do that. That's actually a hard thing to do because for longevity, you have to protect the young people, not the old people. Because the young people contribute much, much more to longevity than the old people. It's a hard thing. You know, people spend most of their money, more money on healthcare in the last year than the rest of their life. I don't see it as an easy problem.
You were just referring to the flu. At the beginning in particular, there was the comparison often made with the common seasonal influenza, even among scientists. I remember that Fauci initially, for instance,
yes, I know, on the 28th of February.
Yes, that was considered as a working hypothesis at that time. In the meantime, this assumption has been withdrawn by many, and to me, it seemed like anyone who these days still compares corona with the flu is considered as a corona denier to some extent. The question I asked myself during this process, why don't we go and put, just because I think corona is seems to be the closest to the flu, why don't we go and put the flu and the corona curves in relation to each other and see how they relate to another?
So I did this. I mean, I have again, most things I do now go onto Twitter. I mean, I can send you the documents if you want. So usually what I do is I make a Word file and then I make it into individual tweets. So basically, in Europe, there's a wonderful mortality database called Euromomo.
Yes.
And they collect data from all of Europe, a population of 350 million people. They actually don't collect all of Germany. They only collect Hesse and Berlin, but it doesn't really matter. They collect all of Italy and everything like this. And there they give you the excess deaths. And they have data, consistent data for the last 4 years, the same database. And there was a fairly severe flu in 2017, 2018. and then there was Corona. So if you just simply say, look at the deaths between, I think it was the beginning of December 2017 to, I think it's April or whenever it stopped, to March in 2018, and compare that with the deaths from about beginning of March or end of April, end of February this year. What you find is, you find two things. So one thing that was a big surprise to me is that if you look at, you get all the deaths, and now you ask how many over 75, how many under 65, the pile of deaths, you find that flu and corona are identical. In corona, 50% are dying over the age of 85, exactly the same thing for flu. For corona, 8% are dying under 65, exactly the same for flu. So that, I mean, it's remarkable because you could actually argue that the death profile is an indicator of what the disease is doing. So this is killing people, and the natural death profile isn't the same. If you natural deaths, twice as many young people die from natural death. So 16% of the people under 65 are natural deaths in Europe. Okay, so that's interesting. The other thing is, what are the total numbers? And today, well, we'll have new numbers tomorrow. But as of last week, the numbers come out every Wednesday, every Thursday evening. As of last week, the total number of deaths from corona was 160,000. These are excess deaths. And the total number of deaths from that flu epidemic was 133,000. So basically, corona is 26% more. So now everyone says that's corona with lockdown, but I'm not sure about this. I think the too many countries look exactly the same, and I don't think the lockdown in Austria was as bad as the lockdown in Iran. Yet we're finding very similar figures. So this shows that maybe these things are totally different, but they have the profiles of mortality for different age groups and very similar total deaths in their season. So, I think that you can say that they're very different. I know that the viruses are different, and where they are very, very different, and I want to emphasize this, is for healthcare workers. Healthcare workers who are treating patients with corona are subject to a number of very difficult conditions. They have no vaccine. They haven't been vaccinated. They're under great public pressure. Everyone is counting, looking at them. In the same time that in Europe, we had 150,000 corona deaths, we actually had another 600,000 non-corona deaths. But no one even talked about them. I mean, they were just not counted for. So I think these things made it very difficult for the healthcare workers. A lot of the patients were very, very old. Patients who, my guess would have been that if they had come in with other conditions, the hospital personnel would feel much less pressured to resuscitate them. Because, when you're 85 and you're not well, because it's not just the age. The people who, by and large, died from corona had other conditions. So I think what you're saying may well be true, but I think that when we come to look back at this without the political hysteria and so on, the assumption is going to be that it is basically quite similar to flu in terms of its impact on death. And I think that's what you have to look at. So I actually disagree. I think it is similar to flu.
It's also a question, the people that get treated in the hospitals, the elderly people, if they would have been treated in the past as well, because I heard some medical professionals who said that in the past, those people would have been treated with palliative medicine rather than with intensive care.
Exactly. In some countries, I did actually hear that there was an incentive to try to classify patients as COVID. So if a person came in with, in America, it was the insurance companies. You got more money. If you had a COVID patient, you got more money from the insurance company than if you had a pneumonia patient. People always have multiple conditions. So if somebody comes in and has one course of COVID, you say he's half COVID and you get more money. I think this is something that's happened all the time because very often the symptoms for COVID are quite hard to detect. I actually think that, one thing I'd like to discuss with you, which I think is very important, you say you're relating to a younger population. So you could make the following argument, and this is something that although I'm definitely an aging baby boomer. I'm 73 years old. I very much realize I have grandchildren, I have children. I very much realize that the future are young people. Now, this might seem, well, that's obvious. Of course, the future is young people, but I don't think everyone realizes that. And for me, the death of a 16-year-old is infinitely worse than the death of me. I choose myself, 73-year-old. I've had a good life. I've lived in a time when there was great prosperity, and I think that in some ways one needs to ask the following: was the future of the young people, the people that you're talking to, endangered quite significantly to save a number of lives that was similar to a severe flu season? There's no doubt that the number of lives is similar to a severe flu season. I did the same calculation in America and I got the same thing. So I think that's an important question to ask. And I think, I think in some ways, and, the other thing is also the political fallout here. It's not going to fall so much on the old people because, in fact, savings and, the stock market has done remarkably well.
Yeah.
But I think if you are a 20-year-old or 25-year-old and you're planning a business or you're getting your education or whatever, trying to buy a house, it's going to be a lot harder. And I think this is something which, I don't know, I feel, I guess I'm a guilty baby boomer. I feel guilty about what my generation has done. And I'm surprised the young people aren't more angry. I think this is still coming. I think what we're seeing in America, the political unrest, is poor fighting rich. And in general, the generation, I mean, if you look at, say, under 40-year-olds today, they are much less well off than when I was 40 years old, 35 years ago. So I think this is an important thing. So we'll see, I don't know.
Do you think that, I mean, you said that the young people aren't more angry. I was just thinking, I saw the other day, it might be like 2 weeks ago or so, I saw like young girls in their 20s wearing like t-shirt where it stated, "Every granny counts," it said. So it was related to that we should also save the elderly. Do you think that this Corona thing might have, as a consequence, a conflict of generations?
I think so. I think that sentiment. I also had a lot of I have friends on Facebook who are in their 30s and 40s, and they also felt that I was a cold-hearted killer. I mean, I wasn't quite cold. Let me just say, my mother is 105 years old, and she's fine. She's in lockdown in London, and she's in great condition. But I'm just saying that I think that I even asked people, "Do you think that a life of a 20-year-old is the same as the life of an 85-year-old?" They said yes. And I said, basically, with that logic, we're in big trouble because we have, because if science, for example, let's imagine science can make me live forever. Well, that's the end of the young people. I think it's at stake. I think I think this will sink in. The granny killer T-shirts will go away, and they'll become much more angry because it's financial. It's a zero-sum game. You cannot spend the money. Lifespan is getting longer and longer. In most European countries, the life expectancy is creeping up by a month or so every year. This means that it's more and more expensive. And in some ways, these people, older people are generally less productive. I mean, somebody in a nursing home is less productive than somebody in college or starting a business or working in a car factory. So in some ways, the young people are subsidizing the old people. I don't know. I think that this has lots of consequences. It's something which actually hasn't been discussed very much. I had an interview on Unheard, and at the end, I said this comment quite strongly. It's something I thought about. In fact, when Corona first started, I posted something to our family WhatsApp group saying, this is now punishment for us baby boomers. This only kills old people, and you guys are fine, so you're taking us out. I think it's something I would imagine that as you have more of your discussions, this is going to come up. And the other thing also is I think, unfortunately, in Europe, a lot of people aren't having children. And, so maybe it's getting to a situation where you prefer your granny because you don't want to have a baby. And that's fair enough. But unfortunately, it means that Europe is heading for extinction. Because if you don't have any babies, you're not going to your population pyramid is going to be very unstable. And the population will either become totally immigrant-based, which is fine, or else, we're talking now in Japan and Korea of closing half the primary schools, half the kindergartens. A population, when they expect the population in Japan to drop by 25% in the next 25 years. That's a pretty, now if you just think what that means, that has a huge effect. So I think that, I don't know, this sentiment is of a concern. Unfortunately, it's also true in China. They don't have enough young people. In the United States, they solved this with a lot of immigration, although they're against it. I guess certain European countries are also solving it with immigration.
Trying to do this, yeah.
Yeah, Sweden is definitely trying to, and I think it's a good thing to do. But maybe, those young girls should be told, go and have babies and leave your grannies alone.
I mean, this is an ethical debate that I think started during this Corona pandemic. I recently talked to a historian, and he was referring to the Hong Kong flu in 1969, 1970, something like that. And he said that the numbers and the appearance of the disease and so on was very comparable to this disease. But at that time, people felt relieved that it only affected the elderly. And no one was thinking about the fact to keep them alive or not. The majority of population were just felt relieved at that time. And these days, people start debating, as you said, which life is worth more, life of a 20-year-old or life of an 80-year-old. And he argued that this can be seen as a progress in humanity.
Maybe. I think that, firstly, I would love you to email me the name of the person so I can look this up. It's something which I think is very, very interesting. You could look at it as a progress in humanity. You could also look at it as the baby boomers, who in the 69s were young people, continuing to dominate. And now that they're old, so basically, when the baby boomers were in their 30s, we didn't care about old people. Now the baby boomers are in their 60s, we care about old people. You have to be very careful of this. I imagine a historian is also in this age. It's not clear to me, for example, how would you, so are we going to say that all people are the same value, irrespective of age? Are we going to say that, you can make this decision. Certainly, if I wanted to get health insurance, if I moved to Germany and wanted to get health insurance, it would be very hard for me to get health insurance. So this may be humanity, but no one would insure me. They would simply say, well, look, even if you're very healthy and you can bring all the medical tests, they would say, I'm sorry, you're old. So
it's a matter of opportunity costs here.
It's not just that, it's also fairness. Because if you have infinity things, you could say, okay, the young people have everything they have. But think about, you have a chance to spend a lot of money to let me live an extra 6 months. And for that same money, you could probably improve the healthcare of 100 immigrant children. Now you could say, oh, he's important, he's a smart guy, he knows, but that isn't right. I mean, I think the fact is, because if we take this to the extreme, so now we have an old person who has 2 days to live. And if we spend $1 million, we can make him live 3 days. Is that worth doing? I mean, you can make these arguments ridiculous at some point. And the fact is that every country, no matter how rich, has a finite healthcare budget. And therefore, if you spend the money to give me a very pleasurable extra 6 months, then somebody else is going to suffer, either in education or whatever. And I think that if you look at the share of the economy, let's say going to the under 40-year-olds versus the over 40-year-olds, that has changed enormously in the last 30 or 40 years. And so I think these people are wrong. I think it's very easy to, it's very easy, especially at my age. I should be saying, oh, you're right. Especially important people like me should live longer. And, what do you guys know? And, but it's not true. It's not fair. It's not right. So volunteering to jump off a bridge, but I'm simply saying that this has to be balanced in a smart way. And I think that what you said about the Hong Kong flu, I think is very revealing, because I think it shows that in a period of 50 years, things have changed dramatically. And remember, that's the 50 years of baby boomers. The baby boomers in the 1960s were protesting against Vietnam and things like this, They were. So I think we have to be very careful about these arguments about humanity. For example, is it humane to let there be as many people as they want to live? In other words, every baby has equal rights. You could argue that it's killing the earth. I mean, I think these arguments that have been made by philosophers for centuries, for millennia, are very, very difficult. And ultimately, the only way you can do it is to rationally put a price on a person. And they do this. They have disability allowed, loss of life. They have years of life lost. Economists do this all the time. And then you can say, okay, well, we'd love to give you, a brain transplant. It'll cost $100 million. So we'd rather invest it in 1,000 people somewhere else. I can see you aren't convinced, so you probably think I'm a
no.
I'm
I'm just thinking about what you're saying, because I feel like I can comprehend both sides on this discussion, and I'm not finally decided on which side I would positionize myself at the moment. But from what you're saying, what I get is you need to be balanced. It needs to be balanced.
Absolutely.
And this discussion is likely to go in a direction where it's unbalanced. And it's like possibly like in all areas of life, it needs to have the right balance. But I think in this situation, it's like, I don't want to call it emergency, but it's not like everyday life that all of a sudden you're confronted with such deep passion, and people are just unprepared for this.
I understand that, but I think you would agree with me that if we, again, let's say we divide the population to under 40, over 40.
Yeah.
I think much of the burden has been borne by the under 40-year-olds.
Yeah.
I mean, whereas the over 40-year-olds have borne much less of a burden. And again, what I find always alarming is that since the burden of death is not dissimilar, 26% more than flu 3 years ago, there was a much worse flu 6 years ago, I just didn't bother to look at it, is not something which is truly enormous. The extra deaths, there's an extra 25,000 deaths or something like that. That sounds like a huge number, but that is 3 days of death in Europe. It's not a huge number. It's a tiny number, because people don't realize that people die all the time. I mean, this is something which I looked up very early on in this discussion, how many people die every day. And in the world, 150,000 people. I mean, and then somebody said to me on Twitter, I think, but 250,000 are born, and that's the problem. So, my feeling is as we move forward, facing the really great challenges of climate change, pollution, global governance, and things like that, we're going to have to be much, much more balanced to solve these problems. Yeah. And let me just say, you were talking about AI, and I've been quoted, and I wrote it somewhere, and I talked about it. For me, the one hope for humanity is that AI will improve very dramatically over the next 10 years. And in 10 years' time, when there's something like this again, instead of panicking, we'll go to our phones and we'll ask Alexa and Google whether we should panic. And Alexa and Google will give us a good answer that we'll believe, in the same way that we want to drive, we use Waze or Google and so on. And I think, I mean this seriously, I think that people did not apply a lot of common sense to these discussions. And I again think that the people who are denying that COVID is like flu are doing it for political reasons. I'm prepared to bet that Fauci in a year's time will say he was right in the beginning, because the numbers are like that.
Yeah, because they're confronted with the pressure of the public.
Huge pressure.
your colleague from Stanford, Professor Ioannidis, published an article in March, and the headline, I remember, stated like, is there a, what did he say? Is there a Corona fiasco or a science fiasco coming? Do you think that science is in danger of embarrassing itself here in the Corona pandemic? Because you said it's what you've done, your calculations were in rocket science, and you just dived into the numbers that were available and made conclusions of this. For instance, I remember the model calculations from that were used in the UK by Neil Ferguson, who was the chief advisor of the British government, and he repeatedly did model calculations where he published numbers that were out of this world, and he said that in the UK there will be 500,000 deaths coming. Yeah. So far until today, there are deaths, but not as many as that predicted. So the point I want to make here is, just one last sentence, the point I want to make here is that I could imagine that people, same as what happened to the media in recent years, that people turn away from media and say, okay, this is fake media, they are lying, they are telling untruth, that the same could happen also to science, because people don't understand the ambiguity that science is in, and that nothing is like 100% clear in science, and that people then might say, okay, the people from scientific community, they are exaggerating, they are telling lies whatsoever, and that this phenomenon then could be transferred to other topics, such as, for instance, climate change.
I think, well, let me just say about Neil Ferguson, I mentioned before my article in the Medium. After publishing that, I was actually in communication with Neil Ferguson. And I said, look, your numbers don't fit the Diamond Princess. And he said, oh, they do. And I said, I'm sure that the burden of death is a month, not a year. And he said, no, you're wrong. And I tried arguing with it. I actually sent him my Excel spreadsheets. And in the end, I just said, whatever. I'm not gonna fight it. I was completely right. Now he will say that it happened because of all the lockdown. Mm-hmm. So in some ways they can't be wrong, because they make a huge. But I don't believe that. England, the deaths in England, I predicted, using the Diamond Princess as a model, England was expected to have 50,000 deaths. Mm. Exactly. 1/10 of what he said. I mean, it's very simple. It's proportionality. Diamond Princess, by Ferguson's model, would have had 60 deaths, and it really had 7. So you divide everything by 10, and you get the right answer. Diamond, a much older population than Britain did. So I think there are things like that. I think Ferguson was a very particular example. He was very sure of himself, and he was listened to. I think that epidemiologists don't mind being wrong on the high side. They don't mind saying Ebola will be, 100 times worse than it is. The World Health Organization is also guilty of this, because they feel that their aim is to stop the epidemic. Mm-hmm. They in no way consider the damage they did. And let's just imagine that lockdown caused no damage at all. There was no economical disruption. There was no social problems. Schooling continued completely naturally without being in school. I don't mind. One of my friends said it's the great Corona do-nothing holiday, except that it caused a lot of collateral damage. So I think you have to be very careful, and I don't believe that the epidemiologists worked out the damage of not locking down versus the damage of locking down. That's why a very large estimate. So I honestly, this is why Sweden was so important, because Ferguson predicted in Sweden 60,000 deaths. Mm-hmm. So if it gets to 60,000, he's right. If it doesn't, he's wrong. And of course, you can always say, yes, but Sweden has a different population density, a different climate. You can always make excuses. But the fact is, so about the truth in science, I think what I found particularly dispiriting here, so I, from the very beginning, just sent out my reports. I wrote 24 reports, just sent them out completely freely, put them on the web, and didn't engage in Twitter because I didn't know about Twitter. Mm-hmm. Very well. Expected scientists to engage with me. When I sent this out to learned societies, I said, let's discuss. And instead I got the most vehement, unpleasant reactions from scientists, much worse than from the general population. Mm-hmm. Because they were so scared that I would encourage the less educated people not to lock down. For a scientist to lock down is zero hardship. In fact, it's a great benefit. You can sit down quietly at home, write your papers, not have to teach. I mean, it really is a great treat. But they don't consider all the people who run restaurants, who drive taxis, who basically are losing their livelihood. I think there is some threat to the integrity of science. Again, for me, a very unexpected experience. I started to be fairly active on Twitter at the beginning of April, and it's been the most amazingly enjoyable experience. I think I've made a little bit less than 400 tweets, or a little bit less than 500 tweets so far. I have almost 16,000 followers, and everyone is so nice and so helpful. I say something like, do you know what the excess deaths in Germany are? And in a second, I get the numbers. I get them translated for me. They say, well, can we work on your Excel? I mean, it's like having the most collaborative research group. Now, I was very prejudiced against Twitter, perhaps because of certain politicians that use it all the time. But it was a wonderful experience because basically, every now and again, there would be somebody who would argue with me. And I said, in science, we love arguments. I mean, if somebody says, you had a random person that said, published, there's a mistake on page 5, just as a random statement. You would go back and you would look at page 5 and you'd find a mistake there because there's mistakes everywhere. So I think that there may need to be a change. I'm worried about the monopoly that some journals have. During this lockdown, it was very frustrating that certain newspapers interviewed me, and then I couldn't even get the article without paying them.
Really?
Or a lot of very critical papers were behind paywalls. So I think what I thought was a pity that there should have been. The government in the UK and other places, I mean, apparently Ferguson also influenced Italy and other countries as well, because he had models for everywhere. It should have immediately been a trigger for let's have discussion. The learned societies should have put together a study group. I mean, I'm a member of the National Academy, the Royal Society, Lindau, the German Nobel Organization, the real Nobel Organization. They could have just said, let's have a Zoom meeting. Let's put onto the phone, you and this person disagrees with you. Let's talk about it. Never happened. And this, I think, is a mistake. And again, we're going to face much harder problems in climate change. And I don't, whether people don't believe it or not, climate change is one of those things. You have to believe it. I mean, it's going to start to affect people so much. Again, in terms of not believing, it turns out that in Italy, flu is a big problem because nobody takes vaccinations. In northern Italy, the vaccination rate is 19%. It is 60 or 70%, like it is in France. And there's actually a political party that's part of the Italian government that is against vaccinations. And as a joke, I said to one of my Italian friends, instead of them not believing in vaccinations, it would be much better not to believe in viruses, because then they wouldn't have to worry about it. Reality is a very tough teacher. And, you can not believe in epidemics, you can not believe in viruses, but basically, and that's one of the very nice things I found about the numbers. People have said to me, but how can you believe the Chinese numbers? And I said, I don't know, they behave really well. They look just like the New Zealand numbers. So how did China get their numbers to look like New Zealand numbers that came 3 months later? I don't know. Maybe it's not, it's not easy to forge these numbers because we have so many repeat instances. Or the numbers, in Andorra look just like the Chinese numbers. It's the same virus. So I think that science will be fine. One good thing about science is that most papers are wrong, just by and large. It doesn't really matter. Unfortunately, in this case, I think the panic. I think for me, the biggest problem here was the panic. And I think the panic was caused by the media, probably even more so than Facebook and Twitter and things like that. The regular media. I mean, the New York Times has a front page that will live in infamy. They have a front page where they put on the front page 100,000 names of the people who died from corona.
Yeah, I remember this.
Now, firstly, many of those were not excess deaths. The number of excess deaths from faith is about half of that. But in the same time, when 100,000 people died of corona, another 600,000 people, equally old, equally loved, equal grannies, died of other diseases. So why? It's like, if these were soldiers, like during a war, you might put the soldiers' names on the front page. But you don't just put random people. And this just seemed very, very unfair. And, you know, if you actually take these people and you work out the burden of death in years of life lost, that 100,000 is probably equivalent to 20,000 of average people, because people are so old. So it's a very unfair comparison. It's sensationalism. And, you know, or comparisons were made to the deaths from Corona and the deaths in the Korean War and the Vietnamese War together. That isn't a fair comparison. You know, with all due respect, I mean, you could make the burden of death from the world wars last century were probably 1 million times worse, or at least 1,000 times worse than coronavirus, especially since coronavirus has a burden of death that is like flu. Maybe we need to lock down, you know, the granny lovers need to have lockdown during flu season. They really do.
So it's also about framing here, this point.
Yeah.
Michael, we have to come to an end, but I want to ask you
I know, me too.
Second last question. Do you think that this, or what goes along with your words is that the pandemic, do you think that has reminded us that we are not as rational beings as we like to think we are, and that we are still primarily driven and controlled by our emotions and effects?
Sadly, yes. I was very disappointed, and disappointed because many of the people I met were prominent scientists, and many of them were equally irrational. They wrote me very nice. I got a small number of hate mails from very extreme religious people, but an equal number from very good scientists, and I was shocked.
You're working currently on a prognosis when Corona will end. What is your prediction on this? At least for the northern hemisphere, I think, because I had to look in the numbers.
Basically, we have a new model that does very, very beautiful curve fitting. Just curve fitting, but it's quite beautiful. And we've been testing it by saying, let's imagine we went back 4 weeks in Germany. And what could we have said about the situation today 4 weeks ago? And the answer was a great deal. The endpoints, both in date and in numbers, can generally be predicted. Now, they can't be predicted in the first. So let's say Germany started 8 weeks ago. I don't actually know when. So for the first 3 weeks, you will get very high numbers if you try to predict. But suddenly, when you're about halfway through, you start to just hit the right number every single time. And this is work we're currently doing. We're going to put this into a reprint server because this is very exciting science. It's also very quick. I mean, the whole calculation for the whole world takes less than 1 hour on my laptop for all different dates, and it was very exciting. It shows, in fact, that these epidemics are not random at all. They have a dynamic in exactly the same way. If a rocket goes up, you can tell pretty quickly where it's going to land. By just, I mean, it's the same thing. By, you know, if somebody fires a rocket up, you can tell how it's going to land. Same thing is true for coronavirus, and it's a surprise to me. I didn't expect this to be the case, because the outbreaks in individual countries are very complicated. You have an outbreak in one city, in another city, in northern Germany, southern Germany, all at different times. But it seems to be quite predictable. So we'll see.
And what is your prediction? What is your prediction? When is it? I haven't.
It's a different number for every place. I'm really interested right now in Brazil. Brazil is a big one. We'll see. There was some signs of hope today, but you have to be very careful. Basically, you need to get the same prediction for like 3 or 4 days in a row. I mean, the prediction is much higher than the current level. But you need to get that same number because there's inaccuracies. But it's a prediction that I'm very happy with. So we'll see. I mean, it's very pretty. It's algebra and it's data science, all of it together. So I'm happy with this.
But in the meantime, you can still do the calculation yourself by just taking this number of 450 and applying it to your country. Is that correct?
Oh, that's like a maximum, except not for the USA. New York City was more like 11 or 1200. And that's an also very important thing. In the United States, the number of young people who died, it was much, much higher. Maybe I told you before that in Europe, it was 8%.
Yeah.
In the USA, maybe it's a big difference, 3 times higher. Maybe due to less good healthcare, less caring about personal health, obesity, diabetes.
Pre-existing conditions.
It's a very scary thing.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. What is your learning from this pandemic for your future?
That real-time science is really fun.
Glad to hear that, and glad to hear that you find another hobby with Twitter, with the Twitter community.
Oh, it's really nice.